Would the memory techniques and the mental techniques popularized by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in the Sherlock Holmes stories help Sherlock if he was a real 21st century detective? Well, I am a real 21st century detective.
You lie!
And that's what we're going to talk about in this video with some tips from someone who's also a memory expert.
I think you're telling the truth.
Okay, I admit it. This is just a toy badge. I'm not really a detective, and the hat doesn't help either. Wait a second. Cheshire! I told you, this is the memory improvement channel, not the cat in the hat channel. Jeez. I must say, I do look like a pretty cool cat in this hat though, don't I? But you know, all my memory expert street cred aside, I do have some interesting experiences that make it possible for me to comment in a legitimate way on what 21st century memory techniques would look like in a detective scenario. For example, I'm a graduate of Writers Detective School, which is put on by Detective Adam Richardson. Although it's not exactly the same from the real thing, and far from it, I did learn a lot about police investigative procedure and homicide investigation. And when I was writing my PhD, I actually worked as a store detective to help keep the university debts down, and my dissertation, which was about friendship, was also about friendship in the relationships of people like Dr. Hannibal Lecter. So I not only read all these books and watched all the movies, but I thought deeply about how friendship and detectives work together in order to catch criminals, and how sometimes the friendships in those criminal relationships are essential to the themes of detection. And yes, for what it's worth, I've got a fedora. Cheshire! So to answer this question of what memory techniques would look like if Sherlock were a real detective, using the memory palace or mind palace, using associative imagery in real time, using recall rehearsal to remember things on the fly and get them into long-term memory forever, in this video we're gonna look at what detectives actually deal with and talk about how these techniques could be used in real time. So if you're new here and you want to join our league of memory detectives, get subscribed now, and for the love of memory, tickle that little thumbs up button to let the robots know that humans still care about being able to not only remember things, but use what we can remember in real time to deduce the truth. And that's what really matters in life. That's how we get better living through better memory. And if you do like Sherlock, I'm thinking of doing an analysis of the themes of memory that come up in many of the stories. It's very, very interesting indeed, and although you may have seen some of these details before, did you really observe them the way that a memory expert would? If you think you might like that, let me know in the comments, and let me know what your favorite Sherlock Holmes story is. So let's just start with my gig that I had for a good long while as a store detective. I had to know multiple codes for different parts of the store and different codes to talk. We had little microphones in our keychains that helped us talk to different people up in the eye in the sky room and so forth. And we needed to know there were 16 different cameras, and there were all kinds of codes and commands for operating that. And this would translate to some of the things that certain detectives do to surveil different areas, needing to know different codes, commands, lingo between your partners. Lingo that some of the shoplifters used was very, very important and needed to be committed to memory. And the more that you knew of that, the more that you could actually overhear people while you were walking through the stores. And make no mistake, I mean, I saw people who fit chainsaws underneath their skirt. They actually had rigging underneath their clothes that enabled them to hook some kind of big, large object as big as a chainsaw underneath their clothes and look like they were pregnant. This is very, very sophisticated crime, and they have lingo amongst themselves, and being able to overhear what people are saying as code and so forth is very, very powerful. Not only that, but some of the codes that we needed to know was from the cashiers, because the cashiers were often trained properly to notice when there were certain things going on with credit card fraud. So we would have to hear a code 9 if you were up in the eye in the sky room. You would have to be able to recognize what those codes were and then be able to respond accordingly if a cashier suspected anything going on with a credit card issue or other payment fraud. So although this experience was relatively small for me, it was actual detection, and I needed to use memory techniques. First of all, I had to be a security guard, and I used memory techniques to pass my security guard exam. And the most important thing is that I needed to be able to relate to actual police, the chain of events, and how that the command of contact was not broken after spotting an actual crime in commission. So what that meant is after you apprehend an individual, you took them back to a particular room and you needed to explain when the police arrived how that you tracked them without breaking line of sight. And this is law in Canada, that you cannot lose sight of the individual once that you started detecting them. And you work often in collaboration with your eye in the sky, the person up in the camera room, and you talk through your keychain microphone how that you're going to keep command of contact with them, one person or the other, because sometimes you will, if you're on the floor, lose them in your eyesight. But as long as the person in the sky still has them in their eyesight and recorded, then you're okay, you're golden. So all of that has to be related back to the police officer. And you're able to talk with the individual, and the individual, while you're waiting for the police, will often try to get information from you, but you're always working to use that conversation to elicit more details from them. And that room is being recorded, but you also want to be able to track in real time as much as possible what they're telling you, so that you can then later relay it to the officer when the officer arrives. Now, of course, if you're a real detective, the amount of codes and lingo, things to memorize, are going to be much, much larger. So for example, you not only have the lingo that you might use in the department you work with the most often, but you may be brought into other jurisdictions and other departments, and they may have their own internal lingo specific to their culture and also the actual way the law plays out in that district. Then, of course, you have courtroom material to memorize in terms of codes of conduct inside of a courtroom and any terminology related to that. You may have different things that patrol officers use that you may have been familiar with when you were a patrol person, but there's just an amount of terminology that's just vast. Then there's also learning the law. That itself is its own study and requires a lot of detailed memorization, and not only memorization, but actual knowledge and keeping up with how things change as things evolve across time and as different governments come into place, etc. But let's assume that our 21st century Sherlock has all of that under his belt already, and now he's engaging in the detection of a crime in real time. The first thing to understand is that it will be a rapidly evolving situation. So our Sherlock is going to want to have multiple memory palaces ready to go in order to not just observe all the details as they're coming in, but to be able to encode them for recall in the short term and in the long term as the investigation evolves. Now, this leads us to a little bit of a paradox or contradiction in A Study in Scarlet. On page 13 of this edition, Sherlock tells us that a person should be very, very careful of what they bring into the attic, which is the term he uses in this story for what we would call a memory palace or a mind palace. The contradiction comes in because throughout the rest of the story, he goes on and on about how he has to pay attention to every single detail, and all those really, really small details that no one else is noticing are so important to solving the crime. So what is it? I mean, how does he know which details are important and aren't if there isn't a total recall of all things in context? So I don't know exactly how to solve this contradiction, but there is one way to solve it, and that is simply to notice that the Sherlock Holmes stories are not really about Sherlock's memory. They're about Dr. Watson's memory, and that's why this story and many others very, very carefully note that they are from the reminiscences of Dr. Watson. So we always got to keep that in mind when we're being critical of Sherlock, is that this is actually presented to us in most of the stories from Watson's viewpoint. And there's another interesting point about Watson's memory that will come up in a little while. Now, if I were a real detective, I would want to have memory palaces in advance and assigned for particular purposes. For example, as information is incoming, I would want to have one just for the victim. And there would be the victim's name, for example. And that name might be complicated. They might have multiple nicknames. Not only that, but they'll have names of family members, names of neighbors, names of bosses, names of students, perhaps. There can be many, many different names that will be involved that need to be connected to that individual that can come in quite useful. Then you're going to have things like the time of death, right? And that will be time of death that is actually reported in a forensics report or a guess that's made by a forensics expert. But there can be other things related to that, such as when was the last time the victim was seen? What locations was the victim seen in, and by how many people? What were their names? What were the witnesses' names? Now, should those go in different memory palaces or not? Well, that will depend on your strategy. I would tend to just put them all in a victim memory palace, and you may want to organize it by room, so you have personal details for the victim in one room, and then details from the perspectives of others who may have witnessed the crime in another room or another series of rooms, and then details like height, weight, age, etc. Those things can be very, very useful to have in their own room. Eye color, hair color, those sorts of things. And you might be thinking, okay, but why hair color and eye color and all that sort of stuff? Why memorize that? Well, if you have information incoming from multiple witnesses, you'll want to confirm that they actually saw your victim, and those details are part of it. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so how do I stick those things in a memory palace? Well, one thing that you can do is have your memory palaces pre-loaded with figures. So imagine you have a room in a memory palace that has Batman on each corner, 4 Batmans. Maybe you have Adam West Batman, you have, I don't know, Michael Keaton Batman, you have Ben Affleck Batman, and you have Christian Bale Batman, and those are in your 4 corners. And so you take the details of the victim and you give that Batman a wig in the color of the hair that that victim had. Then you give the eyes the color of the victim's eyes, and so on. And any clothing details can now be mapped onto that first Batman. Now, you may or may not use the other Batman, but you've got other details from other people that may involve things like hair color and clothes that you can then map out onto those other Bat people inside of your memory palace bat cave for victims. You might also want in this memory palace a room that helps you understand scenes of the crime related to the victim. So property details. And this can get quite interesting because you could actually take the home, let's say, if that's where the crime took place, and place it inside of a room in your memory palace and then mentally navigate it that way, because there may be different things that you want to know about that home and mentally review, such as different portals of access, where someone might have come through a window or where a bloodstain or a fingerprint was found, etc. And if you were to rebuild it somehow in your own memory palace, then you could revisit it that way and mentally rotate it around. Of course, do you really need to do that? No, if you visited the scene of the crime yourself, you could then just use that building itself, and your mind will naturally remember a lot of its big details automatically, and then you could use it as a memory palace for those various details. But already, as you can see, it's a lot to mentally manage. But if you're prepared and you have the skills of having well-formed memory palaces in the first place, you will be able to remember a lot of that in an incoming way, and you can use different things that you already know, such as Batman and different actors who played Batman, and just simply switch out characteristics that can help you remember details of, say, a victim. Now, as quickly as possible, detectives are going to develop timelines, and timelines typically have at least 4 layers or levels of information. And they're very, very important because they help during interrogations to help spot inconsistencies in the stories told by suspects. The first type of information will be time itself. Then you'll have information from sources like CCTV. Another source will be any eyewitness accounts. And once you have the suspect in the interrogation room, you'll have their narrative material to map out against the other layers of information. And if you have multiple suspects, then you'll have multiple layers that also need to be mapped out on the timeline. Now, in novels and movies, you'll often see the detective talking to both witnesses and suspects. But in real life, this is often not the case. There'll be detectives who specialize in gathering data from eyewitnesses. There'll be detectives who specialize in gathering the data and analyzing material from CCTV cameras. And there'll be detectives who specialize in working the interrogation of suspects in the police station. And that's why detectives in interrogation videos are often leaving the interrogation room. And they may be doing it for multiple reasons, such as to allow a suspect to populate imagery in their mind that then later contradicts other things that they've said. But they often go to consult with these other kinds of specialists who deal with the different kinds of data. And then they have incoming information not only from the suspect in the interrogation room, but from these other specialists, and vice versa. And so they're meeting all together, these different kinds of detectives, to help formulate a very, very strong, robust, and multi-layered timeline. So if our real-life Sherlock Holmes is using a memory palace, then how is this going to work? Well, let's review. We've already talked about having a memory palace just for the victim, but what I didn't mention is having that memory palace chosen from a memory palace network coded to the alphabet. So let's say that the victim's name is Charles Augustus Milverton. I would expect our real-life Sherlock Holmes to go to a C memory palace because the first name is Charles. Now, of course, he could go to a M memory palace for Milverton. It's detective's choice at the end of the day. I personally like to go to first names first because that's typically the name that I would use when addressing an individual. But at the end of the day, if you're using recall rehearsal to get that information into long-term memory from the memory palace, it doesn't really matter. It's really up to you. And the whole point is that using the alphabetized memory palace is going to help you have an additional trigger so that when you're looking for a name like Charles Augustus Milverton, you can then think, okay, so what am I looking for? Oh, right, I used my friend Charles' apartment, so that must be Charles as the first name. And then on the first station of that memory palace, maybe you have a calendar from the month of August, and it is, I don't know, being torn in half by Detective Mills from the movie Seven, right? Milverton. I know, you're saying, but Anthony, I don't know anyone named Charles. Well, that's okay. Maybe you know someone named Cassie, or maybe you can just use a random memory palace and have Prince Charles in there and then those other images that I mentioned or something like them. The key is not to hum and haw and worry about it too much. The key is to get started. And one of the things I've been doing recently is I wrote a novel showing a detective learning these memory techniques in real time, and it's going to be available real soon. As we speak, I'm about 63% done the audiobook recording of this book, and if you would like to have a sample now with the audiobook sample of the opening chapter, go to magneticmarymethod.com/NS, which stands for novel sample. And I'm only revealing the cover and the title for people who are interested in that early access and people who eventually have this novel in whatever format, print or audiobook or digital, Kindle book, whatever. You are going to be invited to play my memory detective game. That's going to be so exciting because we're going to have a chance to learn together how to use these techniques, and the master is always a student forever and ever, amen, and we're going to practice them together, and it's going to be a good old time. So make sure to go to magneticmarymethod.com/NS so you're notified when this book is ready and you have that chance to play Memory Detective with me and my Memory Detective friends in real time. Now, we got our review done. What about a memory palace for a timeline? Well, you're not going to necessarily use an alphabetical memory palace technique to select that one. Or are you? This is not entirely obvious, but if you have a number memory system, you can easily base a memory palace on both numbers and the alphabet at the same time using something called a 00 to 99 P.E.A.C.E. See, a real-life memory detective would not only have a full memory palace network coded to the alphabet, which means one memory palace, at least one, for every letter from A to Z, or whatever letters you have in your alphabet. Maybe you got 33 letters in your alphabet, you would have one for each of those letters. And on top of the alphabetical memory palace network, a real-life detective using memory techniques would also have a 00 to 99 memory palace network, which means one memory palace for every 2 digits from 00 to 99. So, for example, a 00 memory palace for me can be either, and I have both, a memory palace where an address has 2 zeros in it, like 200 Huntley Street, or it can also be a memory palace that's based on the sounds S and S, because 0 in the major system that builds the 00 to 99 P.A.C.E. starts with either S, soft C, or Z. So this is very, very simple because my 00 image is either Dr. Zeus or it is Thomas Zaz, and that's because those sounds of those names are matched to the rules that 0 is either a soft C, S, or Z. So, for example, the library I was in New York where I was reading a lot of Dr. Zaz is perfect for that memory palace. Or I could even use this room because this is where Cheshire is always trying to play cat in the hat with my Fedora. So the point is that It's ultimately a different way of looking at the same thing. It's an alphabetical memory palace, but now you're using the number system, which means that let's say a crime takes place at 3 p.m. If you were like me, I would use 1500 hours. And so then I would use my Tal Wilkinson memory palace, which is a guitar store where I bought one of my basses in a beautiful little town called Lille in France. And she's there, she's a bassist. And why? Because 1 is a T in the major system that builds a 00 to 99, and 5 is an L. So her name is Tal. She's a bassist. I think of a music store where I bought a bass, and the image of her in there makes it perfect. So 3 p.m. is where the timeline could start. And then it would just be a matter of using the stations on a minute-by-minute basis, or every 15 minutes, or whatever the timeline demands, in order to craft out that memory palace where you could then place all of those different timeline strategies. At the end of the day, what you're doing in order to place a timeline in a memory palace is having that memory palace be marked out for intervals that have multiple layers of information, rather than just pieces of information like name, height, date of birth, etc., going along a linear journey. Now, of course, there's another way of approaching this or thinking about it, and one is not necessarily better than the other. It comes down to your mnemonic style, which you will develop yourself as you use memory techniques. But think about this. Imagine if you were to have all of the names of the people in a case memorized already. You've placed them in your various memory palaces. You've used recall rehearsal to get it into long-term memory as quickly as possible. Now you go back to those original memory palaces and you assign a signature that helps you remember various details about the time to different pieces of information that are already there. So if we have Charles Augustus Milverton, and now let's say something's at 1700 hours, well, there's an image for 17, and you could apply that to a particular part of that individual's body in your memory palace. Or if you've used Batman to somehow serve as a figure that represents them in the memory palace, you could apply an image for 1700 hours to a particular part of that body. And although there's not really an easy 24-hour clock that you could put on a body, you could consider having midnight at the top above the head of the individual, and then you could have 1 p.m. on the top of their head, like literally the top, because T is 1 in the major system. And then on their nose, you could have 2 o'clock, because 2 is N in the major. 3 is the mouth, so 3 is M in major system. 4 is the rib cage, which could be your 4 o'clock. 5 is the liver, so now you have, 5 o'clock represented on the body using the major system. And I won't go through the whole thing, but you can have a lot of the body involved in a clock. And you could have maybe a twin that gets you the other hours once you tap out on the first 12 hours on the body. Now, would a real-life detective ever be able to do all of this in real time? Well, we know from memory competitions that something like this happens. However, in my knowledge of memory competitions, it's usually segmented. So you are tested on numbers in a specific number event. You're tested on vocabulary in a specific vocabulary event. You're tested on verbatim, and you usually use poetry or something like that in a specific poetry verbatim memorization event. I don't know, maybe there are some competitions where they mix the two and you would have numbers mixed up with words. And maybe poetry is specifically chosen sometimes to have historical dates mentioned or something like that, which would be very interesting and very challenging to bring the two together. The point is that because of what we know that memory competitors can train themselves to do, and perhaps the most multi-layered information that a memory competitor would deal with is playing cards, well, we know that this can be trained. And so the question is, would somebody take on that level of training and then apply it? Would they be able to do it? Which is, again, part of what my novel is about, exploring that question and seeing how it would play out. And the answer ultimately is use things where they're useful and don't use them where they're not useful, but practice and challenge yourself and see how you can push your own limits. And when you're challenged, you will grow. And so whether it's appropriate or not for those challenges to be taken on while you're in an investigation where issues of justice and solving, the pain of multiple families, I don't know that I would necessarily take the interrogation room as the place to practice. But it is something that we can do in the realm of fiction, and any officer of any law or any firefighter or any military person or any accountant, anybody in any field of life, authors, lawyers, etc., we can all, in our personal practice, bring information from the real world into our lives And I have practiced this with watching interrogations on YouTube, which is a very interesting thing to do, and just practice the incoming information. So rather than practice with random stuff from software that gives you a bunch of names or gives you a bunch of vocabulary, etc., what you can do is just simply watch an interrogation, and as information is incoming, information about names, locations, dates, times, etc., you can just start to encode them in your own memory palaces. After you're done watching the interrogation, you can then write down what you remembered and just go through it again. Maybe you 2x speed it and you just check off as a test. What did you get right? Oh, you didn't get that right, or you missed that detail. You make a note of it, and then you think about how that you can apply that to your own daily life when you're at your office or when you're working with your clients, how that you could improve your real-time memorization as incoming information is giving you details that will help you solve whatever problem they have in their lives, your company has in its growth trajectory. And if you're a student, same thing. How can you take incoming information when you're studying and use these techniques in real time to maximize the impact of your learning time as information comes in? It's an incredible practice to take on, even if the actual investigation of the case would probably not be the appropriate time to practice. If you were practiced, then you would have an advantage. But this leads us to the point that I think is really, really important, is that detection as a science has been incredibly aided by the ability of cameras and sound technology to record as much as possible. Everything from the camera on the uniform to the cameras in the interrogation room, they have enabled detectives to be able to capture a lot of information that used to not be captured, so that no one's personal opinions or personal memory is what we rely upon on its own. We rely upon it in the field of a larger context, which makes it much more scientific at the end of the day. And that's a very, very good thing. But that doesn't mean that you should let your mind melt and go to waste and not use your memory techniques, because you'd be a much better interrogator if you were able to track that incoming information, specifically from suspects who trip themselves up when they can't manage their own lies. Now, speaking of interrogations, there's a lot of things that a detective has to remember to do in order to make the interrogation successful. So, for example, they need to read the Miranda warning, and they may also need to confirm in the certain jurisdictions that the individual being interrogated or interviewed can read and write. And these are very, very important things that have to do with statutes and the law in that particular area. And if they are not properly followed, then that can lead to problems in the courtroom, and a lot of cases are thrown out on technicalities when detectives forget these things. So, could you have a to-do list memory palace? Well, absolutely. In Tricks of the Mind, Darren Brown talks about how he uses to-do list memory palaces in order to be able to accomplish more in his life. And as I recall in that book, he says that he is much more likely to get things done that he has encoded in a memory palace as opposed to those things that he's written down on a to-do list. I find that really, really fascinating, and I found that that's true in my own practice when I don't relegate things to paper, but rather deeply internalize what needs to get done with the memory palace technique. It's absolutely incredible. So if I was a real-life detective, I would not only memorize the Miranda warning and certain questions that I was required to ask a suspect while investigating them in an interrogation room, but I would also have a memory palace that I would just go through step by step and make sure that I hit all of those topics. And, I'd probably, in my notebook, have a little list of that too, just to make sure, because I'd want to be as professional as possible. A lot of people think that memory experts only rely on memory, and that their memory techniques are only the memory palace, and they're only associative imagery, and they're only recall rehearsal. That's just simply not true, and that's not being a memory expert. A memory expert uses all kinds of techniques, including having prompts in the environment, which is something that we've talked about in other videos on my channel, including having a mind map in your environment that reminds you of certain goals that you wanted to take on, so that you're not always reliant on even having a to-do list memory palace. But a to-do list memory palace is another layer that helps you remember the important things that need to get done so that you don't forget. So consider using one if you're not already. Now, detectives aren't in interrogation rooms in order to explain aspects of the law, but If you watch a lot of interrogations, you'll notice that some detectives are very, very good at explaining different aspects of the law, and this can be useful in putting a suspect at ease in order to elicit more information from them. So I imagine that even if your answer is, that's not my decision, and you'll need to, go to the authorities that are responsible for that later on in the process, if you are able to give certain pieces of information and it's appropriate to do so, it can be a tremendous tool in persuading a suspect to give you more information of their own volition. Now, on top of being well versed with the law, a detective may also want to be very well versed with different interrogation techniques and may in fact be required to do so in their jurisdiction. And the two that I will discuss now are the Reid Technique and P.E.A.C.E. P.E.A.C.E is a simple acronym. I think it's used mostly in the UK, which simply means plan, engage, account, closure, and evaluate. And account means getting an account of what happened from the suspect, and closure means clarifying the account itself and then challenging it. And they may include explaining the next steps in the interrogation, if any, such as what might happen to the person being interrogated if they are found guilty in a court of law, etc. Now, the Reid technique is more complex than this. It is often described as having 3 stages and 9 steps, and there may be even more than that depending on the account that you're reading about. Ultimately, the steps are not necessarily meant that they happen in this order, but rather they can happen at different times of the interrogation. You can go back to different parts of it and so forth. Often, the way that the Reid technique begins is with the maximization of isolation. And that means that the suspect will be left in an interrogation room on their own for sometimes a short period of time, but often a very long period of time. And they'll often have the temperature monkeyed around with. So they'll either have the room uncomfortably warm or uncomfortably cold. And the cold strategy seems to be used a lot more often than the warm strategy, and they'll often have videos that you can watch on YouTube of interrogation rooms where the person under investigation is huddling with a blanket. And these kinds of temperature strategies are useful in terms of getting more behavior out of the individual. How they actually move in response to cold or hot and so forth can give a lot of body language. The individual may talk to themselves, and you often see this in recordings of interrogations that are quite interesting to see how that maximization of isolation increases their activity that might not otherwise be elicited if they were just left in a room without any of these alterations. Whew, it's getting hot in here under these lights, but the show must go on. So the first stage is a factual analysis that detectives use to determine probable guilt. And the second stage has everything to do with the behavioral analysis, and things like temperature may be used to manipulate that, but also behavioral analysis in the interrogation itself. So does the individual have any signs of submission to authority, as opposed to them having,
I'm not demanding, I'm asking nicely. As a kind civilian that also knows how to manipulate cops,
no fear of authority and physically and verbally projecting either of those extremes? Or how are they behaving? Are they direct? Do they fail to make eye contact? There's many, many things during this stage of analysis that can be very, very useful in an interrogation. And the third stage is the interrogation itself, which is where the 9 steps come into play. Keeping in mind that our Sherlock Holmes would have all of these stages and steps in a memory palace, the first thing to remember is to get the suspect's story before you give them too many details. See, memory is a fickle thing, and if a detective is giving too many details to the suspect, they're going to change the suspect's memory. We know that our memory changes when we are given more details, and we also know that as we relate details, we change our own memories. So we need to be very careful in an investigation and during an interrogation that we're not telling things to the suspect that actually changes their memory. We want their memory as pure and unpolluted as possible, given that it's already quite polluted and far from pure in the first place, so that the material that the suspect generates is not tainted by material from the detectives. The next step is positive confrontation, showing the suspect the evidence that demonstrates their guilt. And this is where having your timeline memorized and all those other details well accessible in your memory is going to be very, very useful, because you're going to be able to say it as it happened. Now, they may use other things, such as photographs. They may show a written version of the timeline to the suspect, and they can also use certain intimidation tactics by tapping on the piece of paper and constantly drawing the individual's attention back to the evidence. The next step is what's called theme development. And this is not only where they continue to provide the evidence, but then start to think about different kinds of motives. And they'll typically start by relating to the suspect and thinking and talking about the various ways that the crime may have made sense. So it may be that there was an argument and the detective may say, yeah, you know, it's only human to get really, really angry when someone directly contradicts you. And, you know, people make mistakes. It's just a thing that happens. And when these kinds of things happen, well, then we need to just be honest. You know, I've made mistakes. I've been honest about those things. This is all part of theme development, and they work in conjunction with the positive confrontation, but a little bit softer usually, and with this human contact, this sympathy and empathy for mistakes that happen in the course of anyone's life. The next step is handling denials. And this is really important that it starts early in an interrogation and that it's consistent throughout the interrogation. Because if denials aren't handled early on, then it can set a pattern that allows the suspect to deny again and again and again and again. So the positive confrontation is well served by having memory at its maximum power so that denials that come up can be swiftly addressed and then readdressed as often as necessary in order to keep the focus on the material that demonstrates the guilt of the suspect. Now, of course, if the suspect is innocent, we don't want the detectives to go haywire and just remember this step of the Reid technique and constantly object to their denials. There is opportunity and need to listen and listen again and to consider things as holistically as possible, which again is well served when maximum memorization and recall of the information is operating at a highly robust and very, very useful level. That can solve a lot of problems in terms of false convictions. Now, let's say that the detectives determine that the person in the interrogation room is not guilty. Well, this is where the Reid technique ends. But if the person is not showing signs of innocence and all things are go, they will keep that person there. And the next step of the Reid technique is to overcome those objections with greater scrutiny of the evidence. So they may use the person's story against them and refer to their timeline as evidence of contradiction. Well, if your story is true and you were across town, why does the CCTV evidence here show that you were very much right in front of this individual's house? We even see you getting out of the car and walking into the house. Why is that? How can you be in two places at the same time? Explain. Because the confrontation has now escalated, the detectives need to not only maintain but often recapture the suspect's attention, because they will do everything they can to deflect, redirect, tell stories about their lives that have nothing to do with the investigation, and the detective has to keep the eye on the ball and constantly bring the individual's attention back to the evidence. One strategy that suspects will use is to talk about the role of punishment, and this is often a way that they use to get more sympathy from the detectives and empathy from the detectives, as if there's a kind of wish fantasy that somehow they're going to be let go if they can connect on that human level. And this is where a detective's use of knowledge of the law can be very useful. And if they can legitimately be able to explain how the law works and say, you know, if you're honest, you may minimize your sentence. And I remember a case, and they can name that exact case, where someone was honest with us from the get-go. Normally, they would get 40 years for this, but because they were honest to us from the get-go, their story made sense, and they were truthful about it. Well, I mean, ultimately, it didn't really make sense, because crime never makes sense, right? But they still were honest to the best of their abilities. Everything checked out. The judge let them go on 2 years. It would have been 40, but, you know, and they can constantly redirect the focus on what really matters, which is the truthful confession of the individual as they go through the interrogation. Because the more they lie, the more that's not going to look good in court. They resisted and they didn't fess up. Well, they're going to get more of the maximum sentence as a result. Another key reason that the detectives want to maintain that focus on the details that matter is that it gives them more material that strengthens the timeline and gives them more evidence that substantiates everything. So if they can remember this step and keep it in play and be able to use other aspects of their knowledge base in order to constantly redirect it there, they're going to wind up eliciting more material that helps the case succeed when it gets to court. The next step is to amplify the theme while handling any passive mood issues. So a lot of people will, go into their shell, stop being responsive, etc. And the detectives need to be able to deal with that. They need to have multiple strategies that allow them to continue eliciting information from the individual while establishing more about the timeline. And this can be quite challenging. And if you watch a lot of interrogations, this is sometimes some of the most fascinating parts where they're dealing with the individual who has just totally retreated and is no longer responsive to any of the questions. And so the next step is very useful in handling this, which is to pose alternative questions. And this can happen throughout an interrogation. So, they're asking questions about one particular area, and rather than tapping that out, they'll switch to another area in order to keep it fresh, but also to surprise the individual and hopefully tease out some contradictions. Give them the opportunity to make mistakes because they're no longer able to track what they're doing. So it's very, very difficult to remember what it is that you've said if you're creating lies in real time, if you're then suddenly answering questions about a different subject. Because when you're accessing information, it's hard to confabulate other information, and it's hard to use recall rehearsal if you are constantly tracking two different things at the same time. You're trying to remember what you just said while you're answering another question in an unrelated area or topic. Now, I don't want this to get into the wrong hands, but if you use memory techniques and you use them successfully and well, you can get better at this. It's related to something called cognitive switching, which allows you to actually talk about one thing while you're doing another. And there's two areas where I have experience with this. So for example, when I go and do memory demonstrations and I remember all the names of people in the room, I'm often doing multiple things at once because I'm hearing a new name while I'm managing the old name that I just memorized, and I'm hearing gossip, things that people are mentioning, details about themselves, and I'm packing it all in, but I'm constantly weaving around. Because when I get to name 5, I have to go back to name 1, 2, 3, and 4 in order to be able to manage them all. And then if other details are coming in, like someone mentions they're writing a thriller novel, which happened at one of my memory demonstrations, Eloise was the name of the person who was writing a thriller novel, which was mentioned by another person named Martin. I have to be able to weave all that stuff in, the names, the details, and so forth. And this involves a certain amount of cognitive switching. And if your cognitive switching gets very, very good, well, then you're going to be able to manage both the production of new information and incoming information at the same time. The other area where I have experience of this is with card magic. And so with card magic, it's kind of really interesting, but while I'm talking, I can pinky count 3 cards off the top of the deck. And you may have seen my pinky do that. I wasn't trying to hide it. Normally I would sort of hide that, but I can talk and I can count cards with my pinky finger. And I think right here I got another 3. I was trying to get 4, but I was a little bit less focused there. But anyway, I'm quite capable of talking while I'm doing magic routines and pinky counting off as many cards as I want. Anyway, I never actually pinky count like this, but in various environments, I'm hiding this, and I'm quite capable of taking 5 cards off the deck while I'm talking, giving instructions to people. Do I have 5 cards here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, just pinky count and do that. And this is cognitive switching. It's actually the production of material while you're managing other things. And what am I managing? I'm managing not only counting while I'm talking to you, but also the physical movement of counting cards off the deck with my pinky. And normally I'm doing it, trying to hide it. So we don't want this getting into the hands of criminals, but we definitely want detectives to be able to do this. So the number one thing I would recommend that you would want to do, even as a student, is to track multiple levels of information. Be able to have names coming in while you're using essentially fabrications. We use imagery to associate in-memory palaces, which are, they're stories. They're not real, but we want to be able to access them in real time while information is coming in, while we're dealing with what we've just encoded using fantastic imagery, which is like a suspect essentially trying to manage a lie and have it all unfold in real time. So practice names and practice some card magic, and you'll be able to improve your cognitive switching, which ultimately will make you a better detective or whatever it is you're called to be in your profession, because you can manage multiple levels of information at the same time. And it is the only thing I know that is real magic. Now, there's a lot more to the Reid technique that we could get into, but the last thing that I'll mention is the conversion of the oral testimony into a written confession. And what's interesting is that often a lot of those details are being written down by a second detective who may be in the room or in another room watching on the camera. And suspects are often allowed to refer to those notes when they write down their confession. Of course, again, everything's being recorded, audio-visual, but that's so interesting because it reminds me of something that happens in a study of Scarlet. And I mentioned before, and I wanted to remind myself to tell you that a key detail in the story, a study in Scarlet, that points us to the fact that this is Watson's memory, not Sherlock's memory, is that we're told by Arthur Conan Doyle that Watson referred to Lestrade's notebook. The notes of detectives are important because they have a lot to do with the success of how a case proceeds through court. And in order to maximize success, detectives in many jurisdictions are taught the E.L.B.O.W S technique. E.L.B.O.W S is another handy acronym that means no erasures, no leaves torn out, no blank spaces, no overwriting, no writing in the margins, and statements to be written in direct speech. Now, I'm mentioning all of this about notes because the E.L.B.O.W S technique is a very, very good way to keep your own journals, even if you're not a detective. And I follow this myself, and I always carry this in my back pocket. And I use something very much like these procedures. Obviously, I'm not going to court and so forth, but when I was on Ben Cardell's podcast and he was asking me about notebooks, and his thought was that, a real memory expert should be able to get by without ever using a notebook. I challenged that and I said, no, I've got my notebook with me everywhere. For one thing, not only do you have things like the E.L.B.O.W S and how that plays out in court in order to have cases succeed, well, the other thing is how are we going to test our memory if we don't have a written record of what it is that we want to remember? And I already gave you an exercise. If you want to listen to interrogations and practice in real time using your memory palaces, how else are you going to be able to test yourself except for writing down what you remembered, right? What better way to do that than using a notebook? And what better way to enjoy your journals for the decades to come, as I do, than to make sure that you have no leaves torn out? It's a very, very nice little acronym, so I hope you'll commit it to memory as well. Now, there is another way to keep notes in a way that you do have your leaves outside of a notebook, and it's very, very powerful. In my Read with Momentum program, I teach how the CIA used this to catch one of the deadliest spies, and I use it myself. I've used it for years as not an alternative to keeping a notebook, but as a supplement to it. And so make sure you're subscribed to this channel if you want to know when the next Read with Momentum cohort goes live, because that's the place that I teach it. The most important thing when it comes to keeping notes is that you make them as objective as possible and you limit the need to interpret them. This is called limiting polysemy in my world as a PhD. We always had trouble when we made these obscure notes and had to interpret what the heck we were trying to say. So I learned how to be as objective as possible and include multiple signatures that would key me in on what even the most obscure terminology was by being objective and having little signatures that I could remember. And then, of course, another layer is using the memory palace as quickly as possible to take those notes, turn them into associations that are laid out in a memory palace journey, and then use recall rehearsal to get it into long-term memory as quickly as possible so that it didn't really matter whether the notes were kept objectively or not. They were in long-term memory already. But the note-taking procedure is so essential, so make sure you spend some of your time focusing on your note-taking strategy. Now, as if all that wasn't enough for a detective to manage, just think of all the language patterns they have to deal with that a suspect may present, and then they have to deal with also the various biases that we have. We have a truth bias, we have a lie bias, and we are all manipulated by those things inside ourselves internally. And we need to manage our knowledge of it, but also remember that those problems are part of the mix. And then, of course, you may have questions that you need to manage that are introduced by your partner in the interrogation room and track all of that. And this can be very, very important because you don't want to be contradicting your partner, or if you do make a slip of the tongue like that in the interrogation, you want to be able to acknowledge it so that you aren't lowered in the esteem of the suspect that you're interrogating. All very important. Many, many details that come up. So how are you going to manage all of that in real time with a memory palace? I don't necessarily know, and I don't know that the memory palace is the best technique for that. At some level, the best technique for that will be practicing lots of interrogations. And the more that you get experience in that field, the more that you'll be able to manage all those different levels of information and know more about your biases and be able to manage them and remember them when they come up. And all the more so if you do personal study into psychology. Psychology across multiple disciplines of human behavior so that you're as well versed as possible. This will lead to deep knowledge that starts to do you, in some sense, more than you do it. So although it is quite useful to have a to-do list memory palace for sure that would remind you of all these different things, at some level, experience needs to take over. And that's what experts are. They are done by their expertise. Things happen to them on autopilot because they've not only deeply absorbed the knowledge, but they've put in the practice to develop what's called procedural memory. Things just happen. The way you get on a bike and you know how to ride it, even if you haven't ridden it for months, because the knowledge of how to operate a mechanism with multiple moving parts is just deeply ingrained in your system. So I would save the memory palace technique for the most relevant things like the timeline, when exactly things happen, so that you can, during the presentation of evidence in the Reid technique, be very, very clear and precise, even if you don't have your timeline in front of you or you don't have time-stamped photographs in front of you. And if I were in a particular department, let's say I was dealing with long investigations that had to do with multiple criminals, I would want to memorize things like different details of their conviction history on a case-by-case basis. And I may have a memory palace just with various criminals in them, and then use that body technique that we talked about to have the details of their various crimes and convictions, and maybe even details about their parole officers and so forth. So the next time that they're in the interrogation room, I would be able to just generate that material at the right place and the right time in order to follow things like the Reid technique and have maximum success in that interrogation setting in order to secure a surefire conviction at the end. And let's think about getting together to be the best possible memorizers that we can be. Because at the end of the day, if there's one thing that I hope you understand, is the bi-directional nature of the techniques. Numbers can be words, and words can be turned into numbers, and we can just see that all information at some point is linked and linkable if we have the memory palaces created in advance. And the ultimate challenge that we face as people is to try to figure out the ultimate mystery of all, which is why that there are so many people who know these techniques exist, but they don't practice them consistently enough to become expert level memorizers. And it would just make the world a better place for so many obvious reasons. There would be less false convictions. There would be more true convictions. There's so many people who slip through the cracks because they know how to manipulate things, and they really shouldn't be able to get through the cracks if detectives were able to better nail them through more precise data management in their heads. And of course, there's every reason to allow the technology to help us in every way that it can. We don't ever want to throw the baby out with the bathwater just because there is the possibility to use memory techniques at the maximum level. But we also don't want that ability to use technology to melt our minds, to turn it into just absolute blah, 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 which is what's happening to so many minds that have relegated everything possible to technology. We need to take on those challenges. And if you have a longing in your heart to master your memory and you ever get stuck, remember, all information is ultimately equal. You really do just need to figure out the mystery of why you're not sitting down and mastering these techniques. And there's many, many ways that I can help you on this channel. There's many videos where I've talked about my personal memory habits. There's so many things that I myself have to do in order to get myself to succeed. And memory is a huge part of it. The resources are here for you. And that is the ultimate mystery to be solved, because the ultimate crime is when you are not operating at your highest possible level to be your highest possible self. Solve that crime and you will enjoy a paradise free from disruption day after day. You are that detective. This is what our culture has been trying to tell us for thousands of years. What is the great play Oedipus Rex, which was developed into some of the best crime stories that we know? It's the basis of Chinatown, for example. It's the basis of Minority Report. It doesn't really matter what the genre is. Oedipus is at the core of it. Oedipus is the play about a detective who had to figure out how that he was the criminal he was looking for. And that's what we all are in life. We are the one who is at the core root root of why we're not succeeding. So I hope to focus our attention collectively as a community on why that we are the central criminal that needs to be freed from that criminality and use memory techniques at the highest possible level. And so, if nothing else helps you, maybe learning our tradition, going back to Oedipus as the case may be useful to you. And in order to do that, I highly recommend that you watch my video on the art of memory next. And when you do, use the E.L.B.O.S technique. Not only for that video, but go back and watch this video again and use the E.L.B.O.S technique to take notes, and take notes on everything you do, because those notes can be very easily transferred into a memory palace after you cull out the most important details that you want to remember, and then use that memory palace to get that information into long-term memory. But get your elbows involved one way or the other. And I hope you enjoy watching The Art of Memory as we go into the past of this tradition next.